We now find ourselves in a situation where I'm wondering how much ammunition is left out there, both at government levels and central bank levels, to deal with another wave of COVID.
Thank you, Mandy. I think, it is true that they threw everything at the problem last year. We had combination of monetary, fiscal, as well as regulatory policies, especially on the banking side, working together to lift us out of that pandemic, which we thought would be, a short-lived shock to the economy. But now we are facing the same problem again. And in some cases like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the daily cases are, much higher than what we had last year. The stress on the healthcare system is much stronger. And yet the restrictions are actually, they're tightening, but they're not back to where it was last year. This is just the government's coming to realization that, the restrictions alone may not work. On the policy space, we do think there are pockets of space. We have seen fiscal policy, again, being the, pushing out in Thailand, and we saw that in Malaysia as well, although it's a much smaller extent. Malaysia also has access to the pension fund, EPF, and they're also allowing people to withdraw from the pension fund. So fiscal space is more limited than last year, but there is still some space, especially for the likes of Thailand. It's, however, much more constrained in the case of Indonesia, which has very little fiscal space. It has fiscal space if you look at the broad debt metrics, but actually getting the financing from the market, it's already running at very high levels, and therefore increasing the deficits further will be very challenging for Indonesia. Just quickly on the central bank front, since you asked, again, there are very few central banks in the region who have space to cut or ease monetary policy. Exception would probably be Malaysia. Malaysia still has some space and has shown its willingness to use that space by giving a forward guidance that the monetary policy stance will depend on the data. But we still think when they meet later this week, they will broadly still hold monetary policy on hold when it comes to the policy rate.
And then which of the ASEAN economies do you think have the best prospects going forward? Which ones do you think have the worst as we stand today?
As we stand today, it's pretty bleak everywhere, to be honest. But one bright spot would probably be Singapore, because I mentioned three things, how well you handle COVID, how well you vaccinate your population, and how exposed you are to the global economy. And Singapore ticks all the boxes. And we are going to be getting, almost 2/3 of the population fully vaccinated by August, as the government is targeting, and looks achievable. So it looks like Singapore will be the brightest spot in the region. But even here, I have to warn that, because of the restrictions that we had over May and June, the quality of growth or the composition of growth has become slightly more uneven than we would have hoped, but it still is a bright spot. At the other extreme, just to give an example would be Thailand, for example. We have had to cut numbers because of the outbreaks, but also because of the longer term challenges, and in terms of the tourism sector. We are seeing very good, policy initiatives such as the Phuket Sandbox starting up. But however, it's going to depend on two key things. Firstly is, again, does Thailand get to 70-60% of the population getting fully vaccinated? And that doesn't happen until middle of next year. And second, and more importantly, is yes, Thailand can open up its border, but do tourists come in? And that will depend on what the countries on the end markets, especially China, do when it comes to their border policies on their citizens going abroad for holidays and coming back to China. Will they still require quarantine requirements and so on and so forth? That is still the case. And therefore, we think that the tourism sector will take multi-years to recover back to its pre-pandemic levels. So the outlook for Thailand is not just bleak for this year, but also over a medium-term perspective.